Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I am your host, Dr. Jed Appleruth. We're talking about admissions testing and getting into college and how testing factors in. I'm going to give folks about a minute or so. I see people filling in the room, and I know it's important to give people time to settle in. So we'll just take a pause, a momentary pause as people enter in until we hit a nice plateau. That happens after about a minute, and then we'll jump right in. So go ahead, and if you need to get coffee or tea or water, all those things. All right, starting to slow down. All right, well, why don't I go ahead and begin? The talk tonight is admissions testing and college admissions, helping you get up to speed on all of the changes and what it means to be test optional, what it means to send a test score, differences between the two tests, this new digital SAT, what that's about. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end for sure. There'll be time for your questions. We'll also be sending you a durable link to this recording. So if you want to go back later and watch it and fast forward and play and pause, that'll be available to you. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the primary piece of testing, where it fits in the schema. Now, forever and ever, NACAC, the College Admissions Counseling organization, did a survey of several hundred the college admissions offices and said, what do you care about? When you're building a class, what are the factors for admission? And no surprise, grades have always been the very top. Grades and academic rigor. So your course taking matters a heck of a lot. Your GPA matters quite a bit, especially in your college prep classes. And then testing was always next in line when it came to after course grades and course rigor selection, then it was testing. Beyond that, you have a smattering of things that matter to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the school. The essay, some schools matters a good bit, some schools less so. Demonstrated interest, how much love have you shown the school? Have you shown up and done visits and done tours and interacted with the admissions officers? Some schools, it matters quite a bit. Other schools, about a third of schools, no importance. Counselor recommendations, but definitely factors in the middle a good bit. Teacher recs, activities, but things start dropping off quite a bit from considerable importance when you look at the top, the quantitative pieces, the grades, the rigor, the testing. Those are typically a lot higher than the other pieces, which are more variable. So testing is still part of it. We haven't had a new survey, and my sense is we're going to see a shift from many schools placing considerable importance on it to moderate importance, given that this is now test optional. And the same as most other things here, demonstrated interest, that's not required. Your activities aren't required. These are optional, but still they factor in. So they're still meaningful in that conversation. So testing, we have two primary admissions tests in the US. We have the SAT, which is more rigorous in terms of its reading level than the ACT, and the ACT is more rigorous in its level of mathematics and science. So we have two tests. They've been around for decades and decades. The College Board's almost 100 years, and the ACT was 1959. So we have a long history of using those in America. The overlap is substantial. The overlap between the two assessments is about 80%. They share a lot in common, reading skills with grammar, writing. They both have some science elements, similar algebra, geometry, and so forth, but there are differences. And that's the 20%. And that's why some students do better out of the gate on one than the other, because they aren't identical. The structure in the current form, and again, this is going to change in March of next year, the SAT goes digital, and we're going to have a very different structure. We're not going to have a separate reading and writing. They become merged. We're not going to have a no-calc math. It's all calc math. And there's no more experimental section. It becomes experimental items. I'm going to walk through that in a little bit. The ACT has had the same format since the late 50s. Reading, English, math, and science. Then they have thrown in, of late, an experimental section. Then you have this essay, which is now essentially defunct. People using the essay is more international kids. And there are some schools and districts that use it to evaluate performance, like how well can our kids write, but very little impact in terms of college admissions. So I wouldn't worry about the essay. That really is not for you all. But it's part of it. It's there. Timing has been a big differentiator between the SAT and the ACT, and the digital SAT even more so. They're getting even more timing generous. The ACT has been known for decades to be a speedy test. You got to work fast. And when I began prepping kids on the ACT, it was like 2003 or 4, I began working with timers and clocks because we have to move more quickly than the natural. So right now, in the current format, the ACT is pretty speedy. The SAT has a 40% timing pop or bump. You have 40% more time per question on the SAT compared to the ACT. That's one big differentiator. So kids who can't handle the pacing of ACT or struggle with the pacing tend to like how relatively spacious the ST is. And that's going to be even more forgiving on the digital test coming in March. Structurally, they're similar. You have an hour 20 of math on the ST compared to an hour on the ACT. The English writing, very, very similar. You have 10 minutes more content on the ACT, more questions. Again, there's faster clip. The level of reading is more advanced. You have roughly high school, I've seen between 11th grade and junior year of, freshman in college of reading level compared to a 10th grade reading level on the ACT. That is one differentiator, a little bit harder reading on the SAT. And the science, the ACT has a separate standalone science section. It's 40 questions. You don't have that on the SAT. You have science items that are dribbled and drabbled throughout on the reading, writing, and math sections, but it's not as robust and it doesn't assess science in the same way. It's more reading charts and tables and graphs and some advanced reading. But ACT, it demands some outside knowledge of science, some fundamental understanding of some foundational scientific concepts. So there is more of a science test, although colleges don't really use it for that purpose. Any schools worth their salt, like in terms of scientific stuff, like a Caltech or an MIT, they're not going to look deeply at the science section. They're going to look at if you have physics scores or chemistry scores on your AP exams or your IB exams. They're not going to look so closely at the ACT science section because it's not nearly as rigorous as some of the other assessments. All right, so mathematics currently, the SAT is, it changed in 2016 and it emphasized common core skills, which is more reading math in context of the real world. So you have a big paragraph and you have to extrapolate and extract the math, and you have to kind of read words and pull out the math concepts. So it's more fluency. Am I fluent in this new math? The ACT is more just, here's the math, more straightforward, fewer items in context. And that's definitely a differentiator. The content right now, the SAT is very algebraically focused, Algebra 1, Algebra 2. That's about 2/3 of the items. Geometry is not as big of a deal on the current SAT. You have about 1 in 4 problems is geometry on the ACT compared to 1 in 15, 1 in 16 on the SAT. So it's not a lot less geometry on the SAT. They both have decent level of arithmetic, data analysis in there. You have a little bit of stats, a little bit of probabilities, things like that. And then trig, you have 4 trig questions per ACT compared to 0, 1, maybe 2 on the SAT. So some differences, some similarities. ACT I mentioned has harder math, has like conic sections, parabolas, hyperbolas, ellipses, matrix multiplication, domains and ranges of functions, more math that you don't ever see on the SAT. So it's a little bit harder mathematically. So the question is, you have these 2 assessments. For the most part, there's a lot of similarities and differences. If I assess, 100 kids, 20, 30 of them will do better, on one than the other. Then the majority of kids are going to be, they perform similarly. And so what you want to do first is get a baseline in both tests. And you could use the PSAT, or you can use a practice SAT. You could use the pre-ACT or a practice ACT. Compare the scores and say, okay, am I better on one or the other? If not, which one feels more natural? Which one is more, it fits, my reading style, my speed, my math reading style, all these things. So that's it. Dual baseline tests, and then choose your path. You don't need to take both assessments for college admissions. Once you've checked the box for testing, you don't keep checking it. It's like once you establish fluency, in a language, you don't have to show them any more fluency tests. You've already established it. So if I'm a good test taker and I get, a 34 on the ACT, I don't need to bother at all with the SAT. It's not going to really pop me up. I've already proven my test taking prowess. So you can't keep hitting that note. So find your best test. The way I differentiate between a stronger test is the SAT scale, because all you have to do is type in the word SAT, ACT concordance. It'll show you how these things line up by percentile. And so if I have a 1200 SAT, that's approximately equivalent to a 26 ACT. So a 70-point differential would be if I get a 1200 on the SAT, but then I get a 29 on the ACT, that puts me like a 1290 equivalent. I'm better on the ACT. So even out of the gate, I have a 90-point gain. Within about 60 points, things flip-flop. You have 30 points of error on each test. If you add up the cumulative error, it's about 60 points. So it could be on a given day, if I have a 28 ACT and 1200 SAT, those could reverse, those could flip. But if I get a 29 or a 30 on the ACT, that's beyond the margin of error. I have an advantage on the test. Go with your stronger test. But if I'm within that margin of error, I have a 1200 SAT and then a 27 ACT, it can go either way on a given day. It could reverse if I guess right or wrong in a few questions. So that's the margin of error. So in that regard, I would say to ask the student, which one felt better? Which one do you want to go with? You're not showing a real mathematical advantage on either test. But again, if I get a 30, I'm going for the ACT and putting the SAT to bed forever. That's how that works. In terms of hitting your peak performance, we have a lot of research. We've worked with tens of thousands of kids over the years, and we seem to find that students hit their top score on their third official test for the average kid. Some kids are one and done, some are two and done. But typically what happens is after your first official test, you tend to get a pretty decent pop on your second test. Most sections increase. On the third test, maybe one section will go up, but then you've peaked. So after that, there's very little growth. Sometimes there's even decline. But we find there's definitely a testing effect. Getting confidence, getting familiar, more exposure is better to a certain point. So plan on taking 3 tests if you can. And then some kids are one and done, that's great, but have 3, especially because many colleges are going to super score. They'll take your best section from the March test for math, the best verbal from June, and then they'll combine them. So because schools do that, they super score. That's why it's even beyond testing effects, the super scoring effect is very real and very compelling. Things that help you do better on college admissions tests. This was my PhD research, and I've published it in a few different journals. Practice tests. Practice effects are real. Very deeply proven in literature. Anytime you're taking something for an assessment or a test, if you practice that test, you get better at it, period, paragraph. So more mock tests yielded higher returns. Kids who spread their practice out over more time, they did better, had larger final gains. So if I'm distributing 20 hours of work over 3 months, that's a lot better than doing 20 hours of work over 2 weeks. You need time to learn, forget, relearn, reinforce, strengthen. So it's better to spread it out and first trying to cram it in. That's very established. Kids who started earlier and began prepping earlier as juniors ended up doing better globally. Part of that was mediated by how many hours they did, how many practice tests, how much homework they did. When you start earlier, you just have more time. There's less of a rush. Time on task, not a surprise. This also applies for AP exams, also applies for typically final exams. When you put in more time, you tend to do better. That really is not very surprising. So kids who spend more time to do preparation, and they're doing better. Same thing with Khan Academy's research. Kids who spend 20 hours on Khan do a lot better than kids who spend 4 hours on Khan. Not surprising. Finishing with some momentum is important. So if you don't want to do a big group class in June or July and then wait until December for your test, because that 4 months you're going to forget a lot. You want to keep fresh, keep current. And then finally, having a goal, having a mathematically named goal. I start off with a 23 on the ACT. My goal is a 29. I'm going for a 6-point gain. And even having a goal helps put in context. If I get a 25, okay, I'm making progress towards my goal. I feel like I'm, and along the way, I have stepwise progress, but ultimately I'm going towards a mathematical goal versus just, I want to do better. Doing better is not as reinforcing. It's motivating if a student actually names their goal and articulates that clearly, commits to that goal, that's motivationally beneficial. All right, the testing plan is very simple these days. There aren't essays, you don't have any SAT subject tests. It's a very clean, simple pathway. You have 7 ACTs and 7 SATs. You're going to choose your testing plan, pick your 3-pack first, do your baseline testing, and then choose 3. So it could be I'm going to take my baseline tests, and then I'll be a junior next year. Why don't I take the December, February, April test, and then I'm done. Or it could be I'm going to be a junior, but I'm taking Algebra 2 for a semester. Why don't I wait till the spring? So I'm going to take the March, May, and June SAT. Or I could even take March, May, and then, or if I'm taking all the APs, I'm too busy, I can do March, June, August. There are lots of ways to cut this, but ideally pick a 3-pack of your testing and then spread it out over time. All right, typically the big testing year is junior year. We definitely have some kids who do some endless sophomore year stuff. It's important that you finish Algebra 2, or at least if you're a junior taking Algebra 2, to have at least 1 semester under your belt. So if I'm in Algebra 2 as a junior, I don't want to start testing until I have 1 semester. So that could be the February ACT or the March SAT. All right, your most intense scheduled time, if you're the lead in the school play, you probably don't want to take the SAT the week of the play. If you're working your tail off, or if you're, varsity athlete and you're going to be in state and working your tail off, probably skip that test and save that for the next month. Okay, and that is it. All right, other things, some research. There's a question of whether or not waiting is better. Is it better to wait towards late as a junior in our research, or even as a senior for better scores? And our research didn't bear that out. It showed that typically kids who start earlier end up doing the same, but you can finish early versus finish late, and there was no advantage. The real benefit was taking it 3 times. So there was a testing effect, not a maturation effect, because a lot of the content, the grammar is 8th and 9th grade grammar. The math is 9th and 10th typically grade math. So waiting until you're a senior can help you a bit on some of maybe the reading level, but is not helping you with your grammar skills, which are essentially set, or the math skills. Once you're on to pre-cal and cal, you're on to irrelevant math, forgetting the math that was relevant. So we didn't find maturation effects. All right, the benefits of starting early, that is more spread out sessions, more time, more exposure material. Got it. All right. I mentioned the Algebra 2. If you're in Algebra 2, wait 1 semester before you take it. All right, there's a question out there. Hey, there are 7 different test dates. I heard someone say this one was easy, that one was hard. Someone said April was hard, or they said, June is easy. Does that bear out over time? And over the course of time, it does not. There's variability over the course of 1 calendar year. So you'll have a really tough math section in October on the SAT, then you have a really easy one in December. The next year, that's reversed. And so if someone says, don't ever take October, it's really hard, that isn't a true statement. Within that given year, that's true, but year to year to year, it totally washes out. So just take whatever SAT or ACT test date makes the most sense. When it comes to super scoring, I mentioned that you can submit, your best math score from June, your best verbal score from August, and they'll use that in committee. The ACT does it for you. That if you've taken more than 1 ACT, they're going to automatically generate a super score to send to colleges, because they encourage that. And so your composite comes from different test dates. Some of them could be national on the weekend, on Saturday. Some of them are during a school day. About 2/3 of kids now are taking like the SAT during the school day, and many of them are taking it also for the ACT. So there's been a lot of success in getting these into the schools. The pandemic helped for that. When kids couldn't find seats on the weekends, high schools said, well, we'll host it ourselves to make sure our kids get testing. And that's continued, and they're really having big success with the testing in the school day. And the forthcoming digital SAT is only 2 hours and 20 minutes. And that's going to allow many, many, many schools to administer these tests during the school day for only 2 periods. And also kids are going to bring their own devices. So they're going to be able to test part of the class on Monday, part of the class Tuesday, versus like blocking down the whole class for 5 hours. It's really a much shorter test, which is going to make school day testing much easier. Super scoring, I mentioned the concept, and that's kind of how that works. All right, there's a big push in the past 3 or 4 years to allow kids to self-report scores. So before, if I were going to send scores, I had to spend $15 for each report, and for the ACT, that was, like $15 per report. So I'm sending 3 tests to 10 schools. That's going to be like $400. That is going away. Where colleges are now saying you can self-report, but once you're accepted, then we want you to send us the official scores. And you obviously can't lie, or they're going to rescind your acceptance. But that makes it easier and cheaper for families who are applying to more schools. All right, SAT. We are going digital. So next year, next March, less than 11 months away, we're going to have the first ever digital adaptive SAT, and paper is going away for the SAT, except for certain students with an accommodation with a disability. So otherwise, everyone's going digital adaptive. That's a big deal. If you are curious to find out what this test is, well, wait no further. Go online, bluebook.app.collegeboard.org, and you download the application. This will be the exact same app that is now being used. We administered the first ever digital SAT internationally, and our students had a very good experience with it. Very few issues or snafus, and it's the same test. So if you're wondering what's it like, this is it. It's right there. There's no mystery. And they've already delivered to us 4 official practice tests and 4 linear paper tests for extra practice. So digital testing, it's no more Scantrons. It's very reliable. It's much, much more secure, easier accommodations, faster results. Testing is quicker and more efficient. It's only a couple hours, 2.5 hours versus 4 or 5. Big deal. So the administration time goes from 3:15 to 2:24. But more than that, you're getting rid of half an hour of all this Scantron stuff, passing out the Scantrons, collecting things at the end, gritting in your school code, all that stuff you do at home before you launch your test. So they're going to give you the Blue Book app before test day. You go and enter all your stuff. So all you're waiting for, and actually you download the test at home on your Wi-Fi. However, it's locked with a code, an access code. So you can't open it until test day. You go to test day, they're going to give you the code, and it's unlocked. But it saves you all that data entry on the front and the back. So it really is the complete administration is 2 hours and 24 minutes from beginning to end. It's a total game changer. 8 o'clock you start, 10:30 you're out. So that's 2 periods for a lot of schools. All right. So it's short. They're giving you more time per question. They're giving you short passages, not long form, like 100 lines. Now they're giving you a quick hitter, 8, 9, 10 lines and a question, next topic. 8, 9, 10 lines and a question, next topic. So I've heard a phrase, it's more like TikTok, because you're bouncing around. You could do a poetry session. Then you could do a little natural science and humanities. There was a question, will there be a digital ACT? There is one that's offered at the state. Certain states do it in certain districts and in schools, but you can't opt into it on a national test day. Not yet, at least. That may be forthcoming. And also, it's not adaptive. And we'll talk about what that means. But yeah, internationally, they've administered a digital ACT since 2019. So it's been out for about 4 years. And it was going to happen domestically, but there've been, the pandemic really threw a wrench. You also have a calculator, which you can use at all times. All right, here is the test structure. You have 32 minutes and then 27 questions. 2 of those questions per section are experimental. Then you have a 10-minute break. Then you have your math, your baseline, then your math adaptive, and then you're finished. So that is the whole test. The time per question, I mentioned it's getting even more spacious. Have a look at this. The digital SAT, reading, writing, they're giving you 71 seconds per question. Compared to the ACT, the equivalent time is 44 seconds per question. Look at math. On the digital SAT, math, they're giving you 95.5 seconds per question, compared to the ACT is a single minute. So they're giving you an additional 60% more time per question on similar content. That is a big deal. They really, they did some testing. They actually dropped the number of test items to give kids more time, so kids wouldn't be in a rush. So adaptive, there's a question, what's this, digital adaptive? That means there are going to be 2 sections of reading and verbal and two of math. The first one is similar. Everyone sees a similar kind of test, not identical, but similar in terms of level of difficulty, problems. And then based on how you do, you're going to be funneled into a easier, if you didn't do as well, or a harder adaptive section. So it's section adaptive. Your answers don't lock in until the end of the section. I can go back and change answers back and forth. But once time is up, everything locks in and it analyzes it and says easy, hard. That's it. That's adaptive. All right. So everyone gets a baseline verbal, baseline math. If I get about 2/3 right, I go to harder. If I get less 2/3, I go to the easier. And that's how that works. That's adaptive. And we could go into a deeper discussion if there's curiosity about that. I mean, this is still 11 months away. There will be a PSAT for the current sophomores are going to have the SAT in October. You'll have the first digital PSAT. And there is one question: are the scores weighted depending upon the difficulty of the question? And the answer is yes. So one thing they are doing is there's going to be a weighting of the questions. It's called item response scoring. They're going to be, we understand 5 different weights on different questions, because one of the ways they can be more efficient and have fewer items is they do lots of pre-testing. Part of item response theory is if you get this question right, behind that, I know that you understand these 3 or 4 concepts. If you get this question wrong, I know from testing and correlation analysis that kids who miss this question tend to, on average, miss these 3, 4 questions. They're kind of linked and tied. So for that reason, like there are certain foundational questions that if you miss this concept, you really don't understand this idea. So certain questions are going to count more than others. And for that reason, we're moving away from the paradigm of how many did I get right? And that converts into a scaled score, the raw scale conversion. Now it's not so clean. Now it's, okay, you got 10 questions, but you got these 10 really important, more advanced questions. That's going to count differently. In a similar fashion, if you get funneled into the lower section, by our analysis, you're essentially capped at about a 650. It's hard to get past that threshold, looking at the 4 tests they gave us. However, if you get to the hard, you can go higher up on the harder section. But whatever your performance on the first section, you're anchored in. So if I miss 5 questions, I've always missed 5 questions. So my score is going to reflect that. Whether I go to the easy or hard, I have credit for what I got right, but definitely I get, penalized for the questions I missed. That's just part of how that works. All right, now we're going to shift and talk about the test optional piece. And there will be many, many more talks on the digital SAT. And I think I have one coming up in a couple of weeks. And so I imagine I'll be giving this talk every 2 or 3 weeks until October for sure, the PSAT, and until March, because there will be a lot more interest as paper goes away. So if you want a deep, deep dive with a lot of detail, that is coming. You can sign up and they're free. And I'll be giving these talks very soon. So let's discuss this whole test optional thing, because it's a very big deal. And we can't talk about testing in America right now without talking about this choice component, which was not that prevalent about 3 years ago. All right, so you can either submit your application with scores or without them. So, but having the option does not mean that test scores don't matter. There are many things that are optional that have tremendous impact. There's still a lane for acceptance, but I think that these scores, they're optional, they don't really care about scores. That is a gross misinterpretation of what test optional means. Because also, taking APs is optional. Does it have an impact? A tremendous impact. But you have the choice of whether you take advanced class or not. So don't think optional, that doesn't mean very impactful. Okay. So if you don't have test scores, they will read the application. It's a complete application. They'll evaluate you, your rigor, everything else, your grades. And so, there are kids getting in without scores, kids getting with scores. Now, by the numbers, there are over 1,800 colleges who are test optional. The vast, vast majority. That number used to be 1,000 for the pandemic, and the majority of schools that were selective were not test optional. They were almost universally test required. There were a small cohort that was growing of optional schools among the very selective schools, but they really weren't that prevalent. Schools that were selective wanted scores, and that was the big change. So we don't expect that things will ever go back to the way they were. Paradigm is different. We are in a test optional world, and things will stay that way. And we're getting more schools locking in, saying we're going to be test optional for the long haul. Some of the surveys that were older, they don't hold up as much. Princeton Review did a pretty good survey and said, hey, where are you going to be in 2 years? So ultimately, about 80% of schools said we're going to be optional. About 6% said we're not sure. About 9% said we're going to be test blind, and about 3% test required. Well, the 9% didn't bear out. There aren't that many test blind schools. There could have been some skewing in the sample. They may have asked more California schools. Test blind is about 3%, and test optional is about 90%. The test required is a sliver. So, but this is really an optional world. There are some colleges who want to wait and see. They want a little bit more data before they lock in, like Harvard wants to 2026. Other schools, they want to look at the data and see, hey, kids who got in without test scores, are there any differences between those kids' performance and those with scores? Because like MIT came out and said, we want tests, we require tests, because they found that kids with lower scores were the ones who transferred out of MIT in math, especially. So the question is, for all these schools, are they going to find out, hey, the kids who didn't submit test scores on average had lower test scores. So kids with strong test scores submit them. That's how that works. I haven't seen any conscientious objectors who got a 1550 and didn't send it, because that's kind of silly, because colleges do look at these things. So, they want to see, are the differences in course taking? Kids with testing took different majors, differences in GPA, differences in graduation rates. And after a couple more years, we're going to have a more robust data set to tell. But test scores do still matter. They are a hedge against grade inflation. They are a good predictor of graduation rates, typically. They can help you compare a broad, diverse applicant pool, and they can help differentiate kids who look pretty similar. One of the issues that have taken place in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of grade inflation. And it shows up in the data, the University of California study, that other places, even over at Yale, they said, our best predictor of performance at Yale is not grades anymore. Kids have very similar grades. It's actually testing. They found the same thing in the University of California, that grades have lost their strength as a predictor. They're still, very, predictive, but they're less than they were 20 years ago because of grade compression and grade inflation. But testing still remains a very robust predictor of who will do well at UC in terms of graduation and GPA. So great, tests still offer you something independently of GPA. GPA gives you something, testing gives you something that's distinct. And together, there's even a better prediction. That's one of the reasons why the schools who require them still require them. There are a handful of schools. The Florida schools never stopped. The Georgia flagship schools require them. Our public Ivies here, Georgia Tech and UGA, Tennessee, UTK. We're seeing more of this. The other southern states are looking at it very closely. North Carolina, great school, UNC, and they said they're going to reinstate. They said, actually give us 2 more years. And then Texas additionally said, we're going to make UT Austin their flagship school, test required, a couple of years. Then they withdrew that. So they're toying with it, but they're right now acommittal. But I assume we'll see more schools in the South, especially it can happen in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, even schools like Virginia, who seem to show a preference for kids with test scores. That could flip back. There could be a big southern block of schools who require testing in the next 5 years. So we'll see. And that's one of my colleagues, Rick Clark, said this: don't count on the South. And he lives here in Atlanta, and he is the head of undergraduate admissions at Georgia Tech. And then Tech now requires it. So a few other selective schools, we have Georgetown and MIT are very, very selective schools. Other schools, Purdue, there are a number of smaller schools. And MIT again said, we can't predict who will do well here without testing, because kids who get under like a 680 on the math tend to be the ones who fail out of MIT, because it's such a heavy, rigorous math curriculum. So that's why they require it. They said, we were trying to actually protect kids, because if we let kids in who have weak maths, and they could have a 93 in calculus, but not know much calculus, because grades are not standardized and there are different grading cultures. And there are some schools where they are very generous with grades. Like one admissions officer at a very selective East Coast school said, he got a kid who had a 93, a strong A in his calculus class, but then the kid got a 1 on the AP. And he sent the 1, he's like, oh man, now suddenly he calls into question the strength of that 93. How much did you have a really tough day? And then also, why did you send that score? Don't send me a weak score. But some kids didn't have content mastery. They're being graded on, they showed up, they tried hard, they had a good attitude, give them an A versus, mastery. Do you actually know the content? That's where something standardized tells you, what do you actually know? Not you get points for having a good attitude. So the schools who require it, Georgetown, MIT, Purdue, the Georgia schools, Tennessee, the Florida publics, and the military academies, small number of schools. Then we're going to see more of this. So we have Auburn is a conditional as optionals, and there are more schools like this, that if you have over a 3.6, tests are optional. If you have under 3.59 or below, test scores are required. Because if you can show me you have a 3.9, how much more do I get from a test score? I know you can probably handle the work. If you've barring again, there's rampant grade inflation, but typically kids with 3.9s, in high school can handle college level work in the vast majority of cases. All right, Cornell is one of the first ones to come out and say, hey, if you don't have test scores, if one leg of the stool goes away, we're putting more pressure on whatever remains, which is natural and makes sense. Rigor, other testing, which means if you have any other APs, those become more important, your essays, maybe the interview, other things, and so forth. So then you have the test blind contingent of schools. These are the ones who are philosophically aligned. They say, we don't believe testing should exist in college admissions for a variety of reasons, whether they have issue with access for kids or just they don't like testing. Now, 57 colleges and 34, more than half, are from California. UC and Cal State, those are the big ones. They're test blind. They're also saying test free or score free. Then there are 17 schools who are piloting test blind policies. So that means there are 84 schools in the US, about 3% of the 2,500 four-year schools who are not looking at tests, which means I could send UCLA at 36. Doesn't matter. It didn't happen. They just don't care. So that's unusual, but it's real. Some other ones, Dickinson, Reed, Washington State, Pitzer, Catholic, Worcester Poly, St. Mary's, a lot of small schools. But so Worcester Poly they're competitive. They're up in New York, good technical school. And then so forth. What's interesting is that you have Caltech, which is so similar to MIT. And MIT said we're requiring test scores. Caltech said we're still blind for another year or so. So I'm curious how that plays out, because MIT says we need test scores, but there's a lot of overlap there. A lot of kids who apply to MIT are going to be applying to Carnegie Mellon or Caltech, but they're taking different approaches right now. Curious. So again, I want to reinforce that test optional and test blind are different things. Strong test scores can be a factor. They can help. They can also enhance your chances of getting merit-based financial aid. There are still quite a few colleges out there who dole out their money. There's need-based aid. I don't have enough money, assets, therefore the school is going to subsidize with need-based. Then there's merit-based. I have really great grades. I have great scores, good course taking. They think I'm going to be a great alum. I may be generous with them. I may make them proud. I may give to their annual campaign. Therefore, they'll give me a break on the front end, and they'll cut. They want me to. Also, I make the school look better because I pop their average GPA. I pop their average test score. So they'll use money to lure me in to make their profile better and hopefully have a really great active alum for decades later. That's the idea. Alabama, sample merit scholarship at U of A, that given a 3.5 GPA, they're going to start knocking off some real coin. I have a niece from Midlothian, Richmond, Virginia suburbs, who got a 1390 SAT, and she applied to a number of schools, to Tulane and USC, into Georgia, Alabama. Alabama, because of her 1390 to 35 GPA, Alabama said, well, tuition is normally $30,000 a year, but because of your test score, we're going to make it $6,000 a year. How about that? So they offered her $96,000 for her test score. That's profound. Alabama is distinctive, like they're really out in front, but there are many schools who offer lesser merit scholarships that factor in grades and testing. Not need-based, but just purely based on merit. Okay, some other ones. I picked three: Utah State, Texas Tech, Lake Forest. And I come from a state, Georgia, where we have a very, very attractive merit scholarship. That the Hope Scholarship is merit-based. I have to have a 3.0, which is not that hard. But if I want the Zell Miller, which is the full ride at Georgia, or Georgia Tech, or Georgia College, I have to have a 3.7 GPA and a minimum threshold score of a 1200 SAT or a 26. And then I get free tuition, which is worth a lot. Because tuition everywhere else, in some places, it's in the $30,000 range, $120,000 a year for the scholarship, for 4 years rather. So again, test scores can be impactful on scholarship money. Now, do I submit my scores? The majority of kids are going to take a test. College Board has found that in the Common App. Kids have test scores, but do they send them? And part of it is you send to schools where it's going to help you, and you withhold it for schools where it's not going to help you. Now, there are some rates of submission, and they have really dropped. The submission rates now are in the 40s. Used to be about 70, 80%. Things have dropped. You have a higher proportion of males saying test scores over half, because more males are applying to STEM programs, pre-business, physics, chemistry, engineering. And kids applying to those programs want to demonstrate their mathematical prowess, and they do so with their test scores. That's one of the reasons why there's a skew. We do know that schools that are more selective are getting more kids applying with test scores, which makes complete sense, because if you're trying to stand out in a crowded field, how do I do so? Well, one means of separating yourself from the crowd is having a really strong test score. So I'm applying to a school that's selective. That's one way. All right. And it's, before the pandemic, only 4 out of 100 kids would send scores to some schools, not others. But now in 2020, the first year data, about a quarter of kids, and now I'm almost certain that's going to be well over half, but we have no new data since 2020. But people we talk to all over the country are saying, yeah, my kid got a 30 on the ACT. We send them to these schools, not to these schools. Makes sense, because the 30 helps me here, hurts me there. That's a calculus. Now, also, I mentioned there are different rates of submission by major, that engineers tend to send test scores on average, pre-business, more scores, but gen ed, social work, fewer kids and test scores. That makes sense. The whole STEM factor. Now, the big question parents ask is there an advantage? Will I have a leg up if I have a good test score? Well, Boston College is one example where the answer is yes. At BC, the numbers are very compelling. 17,000 kids applied with tests. You had 23,000 applied without tests. Who got in? 5,000 got in with tests, an admit rate of about 30%, compared to 2,500 kids got in without tests, a rate of about 10%. So we're almost 3x here. And clearly, BC, the admissions office, is saying, we like test scores. And if you have them, we like them. There's obviously a lane for kids without test scores, but that lane is not as large. They are an outlier, but giving you an example of what's out there. These are data that Peter, my colleague, and I pulled about a year ago. And you can look at the differential admit rates. UVA, the kids with test scores are getting in at a 90% higher rate. Notre Dame, 100%. BC, 170%. Fordham, 30. Tufts, 44. Wellesley, 83. Emory, 98. Colgate, 108%. So, you can see that many of these schools who are very selective, they seem to have a preference. I do want to throw the caveat in. There is an issue here of collinearity and correlation. If you've been in academia at all, or listen to podcasts, correlation and causation are different things. Because part of it is this. Kids who send test scores, we know, tend to have higher test scores. Kids with higher test scores typically have stronger course taking and higher GPAs. Not always, but they does correlate. So it could be the higher acceptance rate is pointing to the higher grades, higher test, higher rigor. However, so that would be correlation, and that would be mediation essentially. But there's also causation. And I've given presentations with admissions officers. One of my colleagues over at Emory said, yeah, I had two kids applying from the exact same high school, similar course taking, 3.7s, similar number of APs. One kid sends me a 1520. One kid has no testing. Does it matter? Yes. That 1520 is a weight on the scale. And so in that regard, there's some causal, power there. However, how do I distinguish what's collinear, what's causal? That is data that we do not have and schools aren't releasing, so we may never know. But some portion of that doubling of the admit rate is tied to the other things it's pointing to, but some of that is tied directly to, test scores matter. So know that. So the question is, I have a test score, do I send it? Well, the calculus is first get your baseline in, figure out, should I prep I'm looking at schools where the median test score is around a 33 and my opening salvo is a 21. I need to get 12 points to be where they want me. Do not bother with test preparation. I would, as long as your grades are good and the rigor is good, but a 12-point climb on testing, that's a heck of an ask. However, if the schools I'm looking at want a 30, 31, my opening salvo is a 27. Now we're in the range. 4 points on the ACT, that's our average, 4 to 5 points. So that's no problem. Most kids are going to hit that. So in the grand scheme of things, part of it is how much of a gap is there? Is it worth me fighting for that to be in the competitive range? That matters. So do you want the admissions officers to see your scores? Are they going to be a benefit? STEM kids, there seems to be an advantage for STEM kids in certain contexts. Certain majors, they matter less. Sean Felton has given several talks with Apple Ruth. He's up at Cornell. Said, yeah, if you're a fine arts major, it's your portfolio. Performing arts major, classical music, it's your audition tape. So your test scores, they aren't that important. But pre-business, okay, more important. Ray Clark, colleague, friend, said, yeah, go with your strengths. If you're in the upper half of our testing pool, send them, bring them on. If you're in the bottom half, it depends. If you're in the bottom quartile, I wouldn't send it. I would lean on the strength of your GPA and your essays and activities and so forth. So your GPA doesn't matter, because if I have a stellar GPA, but only a middling test score, do I want to muddle the waters, and muddy it up with, I have a 1250, but I have a 3.9 unweighted. I want that conversation to be solely about my great grades. If my testing is not on par and it weakens the conversation, it weakens the strength of the whole profile, don't send it. So your GPA, however, I have a 3.4, but I have a 1390. Okay, well then my grades are decent, but that 1390, that's stronger on average. So I definitely want that in the conversation. That's part of the balance, looking at what the school wants and what you have. And section scores matter. If I'm applying to like a business or engineering or STEM, and I have a strong math score but a weaker verbal, I probably want them to see my strong math, especially if the verbal isn't that terrible. If I'm a little bit below their profile but I have a great math, get that math score in the conversation, because that's what matters if I'm going to be a computer science major, more than the verbal skills. Treat every school differently. You have the ability to select, I'm sending to this school, not this school, on the Common App. You get scores, you don't get scores. So just be very strategic in that analysis. One example I throw out is the Swarthmore example. So the mid 50 range for Swarthmore, 1380 to 1540. Strong, that's half the kids are in that range. That means half are 1550 and above, half are 1370. I'm sorry, a quarter are 1550 and above, and a quarter are below. That's the middle 50 percentile. So if I score in the top half, 1470 or above, send it. It's a good score. And the questions answered next. If I have a bottom quartile score, 1370 or below, that typically is not going to impress the admissions office. There are a few exceptions that come from an area that's really disadvantaged. I'm a first generation and no one has gone to college. I'm at a high school where the average test score is like 1,000 and I get a 1330. First gen, or I'm from a district in West Virginia where a lot of kids don't go to college, or there's much lower rates of graduation, than I have a 1350, but from West Virginia, that's compelling, and the admissions officers know it, then I might send it. But that's very precise circumstances. The real gray area comes in the third quartile, that 1380 to 1460. If I have a 1460, I'm more likely to send than if I have a 1380, 1390. Also, if I have embedded in there, a 750 in math, I'm applying to an engineering program, I may want them to see it even though I'm below the halfway mark. Also, my grades matter here. If I have a rocking GPA and a 1380, go with the rocking GPA. But I have an average GPA of 3.5, but a 1450, get that score in there. So you see this algorithm, kind of how it works with different weights and different rules and different heuristics. It's not that complicated, but you want to make this kind of analysis, looking at your grades, looking at the school itself, looking at your individual section scores. And you go through your list and say, submit here, withhold here, submit here, withhold here. And it works. My niece applied to Tulane, 1390. The admissions officer at Tulane said, don't send it. If you have below a 1430, we don't want it. And she didn't send it, and she got into Tulane. And they offered her some merit aid. But her 1390 got her into Georgia, got her into Alabama, got her into USC. So she sent it to these schools. She didn't send to UVA, where it was optional, because her 1390 is not as compelling for UVA. So it's knowing where is my score strong and helps me, and where it hurts me. And listen, if an admissions officer says, when Tulane says don't send anything over 30, listen to them. They know what they're talking about. And here's an example of just the pop you get when, for one school at least, when they went test optional. 2020, that was the year that tests were required. Look at the middle 50 for Georgia. 1220 to 1390, that's half the class in that range. The next year, pandemic hits, tests are optional. The middle 50 goes from 1220 to 1390 up to a 1350 to a 1490. Boom, you wipe out all the lower scores, and only kids with strong scores submit. The thing shifts to the right. Then in 2022, they go back to test required, and the number drops, though not as much, because it's just like the word is out. Georgia is becoming a better and better and better school, and it's like the public Ivies. It's like the Michigans and the Texas and Virginia and UNC. It's a great school, and so if you can get in-state tuition, you're saving a mint, and that's why smarter and better kids keep it going to Georgia, because of the whole economics of education. I just showed you some example of colleges where the common data set where it real pops. Tulane pops around 20 points, Michigan pops around 20 points. Vermont popped around 70 points. On average, schools increased around 20-30 points when they went test optional. All right, so Apple Ruth tutoring. We do three things. Academic tutoring, we help your kids with APs and physics and math and writing. Test preparation, we help get them ready for the SAT, ACT. And we help coach kids with executive functioning, learning how to use their resources better. Is there a poll tonight, Peter? I forget if we're going to poll. If there is, it's like literally it's 2-3 questions. It takes all of 20 seconds. If not a big deal. Here it is. Just, are you a student, a parent, educator? Click. If you are, do you have a student, high school senior, junior, sophomore, freshman? Next up, are there any areas that we can help you with? And then if so, would you want someone to reach out? After that, close it. That's all of 15 seconds. And then we can go on to the Q&A section of our talk. We have a little bit of time left. There is a question. What is the score range for 2022 to 2023? And that's going to depend dramatically by school. So every single school is going to have a different score range for this year. You can look at the past couple of years. Oh, for Georgia, no problem. Now I have to go and look, but I know it's higher than it's ever been in history. I saw the middle 50 numbers for the early action, and it blew my mind how advanced, how many APs they wanted. I think like the middle, it was like closer to like 31, 32. Things have really popped for Georgia. It is harder for kids out of state than in state. So that is one caveat. They're getting kids applying from all over the country. But I could pull it up. Honestly, I would just Google it. I don't want to lead you towards towards bad data, but it's the highest it's been in history. I saw the numbers and I was like, oh my gosh, Georgia's gotten crazy, and it has. And Tech also. Tech is like past Emory. The Georgia flagship schools, they're so selective because again, economics. When I was looking at a school, cost of attendance was $75,000 times 4. That's $300,000. That's a lot of money. versus getting the Zell Miller, going to Georgia tuition free, just paying for room and board, saving. So that's the reason why these, smarter and smarter kids keep hanging out at their flagship state schools. That's a major trend. What are other questions? What have I not answered? Are there any remaining? Take a minute. What have I not answered? I'm here. I'm a resource. We have definitely time for more questions. Unless you are satisfied, in which case, that's all right too. Last chance. Okay, here we go. Can everyone apply for Zell Miller? That is a Georgia only program. It's funded by Georgia Lottery. Though there are different schools, different states doing similar things. So the Zell Miller is a Georgia scholarship put in place by Governor Zell Miller back in 1993 and 94. How do you work with students who do well academically but not strong test takers? We do lots of work on testing and timing. We talk about work on their confidence, work on any anxiety issues. We try to figure out what's not connecting in terms of their approach, their process. Are they not showing their work? We're good at that. Kids who have good GPAs, vigor testing, that is a very sweet spot for us. We do lots of helping kids who, quote, aren't good test takers. Hey, I didn't take any AP classes my freshman, sophomore, or junior year. I will take some my senior year. Well, colleges look at that. Yes, colleges are going to be looking at your course taking as a freshman, a sophomore, as a junior, as a senior. They're also looking at you in the context of your class. So every time you submit an application, with your application, there's a school profile showing on average kids take 8 APs, 2 APs, 0 APs, and they're going to look at you in the context of your class. So if you're only taking APs, and also this is going to vary. Like Georgia wants to see more APs. I could look at for the middle, for that early action class, the middle 50 of the class, it was between like 8 and 13 AP classes or dual enrollment or IB classes. It was amazing, the level of rigor now showing up at Georgia. So only taking APs as a senior, it's going to be tough to get into Georgia. Maybe Georgia Southern, maybe Georgia State, but probably not UGA and the flagship school. Same thing with UVA. UVA typically wants 6, 7, 8, 9 APs. So if I only have 2 or 3, it's going to be tough to get in unless I have something else that they want. Being a pure academic admit, that's going to be a little bit light for them on the rigor piece. And rigor really matters more. In a world of test optional admissions, academic rigor matters more than ever. But yeah, they'll give you credit for your APs and they'll look at you in the context of your school for sure. Can we get a recording? Yes, our recording will be forthcoming. It'll be sent to you automatically within a few days. Will preparation for the digital SAT be different in terms of content? Very little. There's so much overlap with grammar. There's a little bit of reduction in terms of certain grammar things they're not testing. They're doing, certain kind of questions for big passages are going away in terms of transitions. But a lot of the math is the same. It really is a lot of similar content, just different delivery and learning how to use the Desmos calculator. So when you're prepping for paper, you're also prepping for digital. And kids can learn. And honestly, when we're doing prep work for the digital test, we're also giving kids paper homework, and paper exams. How do I know what other scholarships are available for me? You're gonna have to do some homework, some digging, and looking at different schools. There's also a website called CAPEX, CAPPEX, and they'll list some scholarships. There's like Scholly.com, and you type in merit scholarships, your state, where you're looking at different schools. But again, there's need-based, then there's merit-based, and then sometimes they can change from year to year, what they're factoring in, what they're looking for, and so forth. Do you provide any career counseling services? We work with colleagues who do. We work with independent ed consultants. If you want a referral, write a note, or we can, info@Appleroot, say I'm looking for some career counseling services. We definitely partner with independent consultants who do this for a living. We can give you a strong referral there. Do we understand correctly? What does that mean, that Georgia Flash universities? I'm sorry, I speak quickly. Flagship. The flagship schools like University of Texas, is the flagship school for the UT system. University of Florida and Florida State are the flagship schools. There's also, like Georgia, there's a lot of, there's Georgia Southern, there's the Valdosta, is part of the Georgia system, but our flagships, the ones leading the vanguard ships, the highest performance academics, that's UGA and Georgia Tech, are the flagships. Sorry, not Flash. Okay. If for some 504 IEP condition, the student has allowed more time for test, is that visible to college? No, that is invisible. Colleges will never see if you get any extra time. There have been lawsuits. That's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any kind of distinguishing puts you at a disadvantage. So you have your accommodation, and the colleges are blind to it. There's no asterisks. That was a change. I think it was back in 2006. I was tutoring back then. And since then, colleges will never see if you get any kind of different conditions. That is now against the law. Are the 4 digital SAT tests that you mentioned available publicly? Yes. Does the digital SAT app you mentioned provide a full practice test? So the Blue Book app provides 4 full digital adaptive SATs. Type it in, College Board Blue Book app, download, bam, you can see it tonight. And the 4 linear tests, type in linear SAT College Board, and there are 4, they're available there through the College Board and Khan Academy. So is there a limitation on the number of SATs I can take? No, there's not. But our experience shows us that after 3, kids tend to peak. So do your practice tests, but after 3 official tests, kids tend to flatline, with rare exceptions. If there was a real anxiety event, or there are very different circumstances, but typically 3 is plenty. My son is in a magnet program. How are the colleges looking at magnet students? They'll give you credit for that, for the they're looking at the school, looking at the performance of kids, from like Gwinnett Tech and Math Science or other schools. For kids going to Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, or New Trier up in, they look at the school and the track record of kids from certain schools. And so that definitely is a factor. The strength of school matters. Your GPA matters, but it's also looking at the strength of your school, no question. Okay. Looking at performance of kids previously from your school. Okay. I think that is it, y'all. It's 9:03. So where I live, I don't know where you live, different places. Everybody have a lovely evening. Look for a recording. Hope you learned from this. And again, if you want to learn more about the digital SAT, I'm giving a talk on that in a couple of weeks, and probably every 3 or 4 weeks for the next year. So there's lots more coming. And thank you so much. Glad this was helpful and useful. Everyone have a great night. And again, if you need any help with any of this content, getting ready for your APs or SATs, please call Alpha Ruth. We're here. All right, y'all. Have a good night.